Hello again, everybody. My name is Laurie White, and I'm the president of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce. And this is episode number 204 of Chamber TV. And we are back today with a really interesting and important topic and a very distinguished guest. And we'll be talking about international trade and foreign domestic investment and bilateral trade agreements between the US, particularly Rhode Island and the New England region, with the UK. And our distinguished guest today is Dr. Peter Abbott, and he is Consul General to New England. And he's from the British Consulate, and he's based in Boston. And we recently had an opportunity at the Chamber to meet with his staff in our offices and talk about some of the many interesting and timely issues that are confronting each of our countries, particularly as we think about the broader New England economy and some of the industries where we have a real distinct and strong competitive advantage, particularly around wind, around manufacturing, and around the broader issues of sustainability. So we will get into all of those topics and more. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Abbott, Consul General. Welcome to Chamber TV. How are you today?
I'm good, Laurie. Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I'm thrilled to be speaking in front of such an august audience, and I hope many people will watch this video over the next few days. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So, just to start out, why don't you officially introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the role and some of your, top one or two priorities over the course of the next couple of months.
Of course. As you've already said, I'm the British Consul General to New England. That means I'm the senior British diplomat with responsibility for promoting the UK and UK government policies in this fantastic part of the world. As I'm sure you and your listeners know, there is no better part of the United States to be in, to be a British diplomat in, than in New England, with so many extraordinary connections, historic and modern, between New England and I say Old England, but the United Kingdom. Rhode Island. It's not always been plain sailing, of course, the relationship between our two countries. But we like to say that's water under the bridge. Although I tend to find in Rhode Island that you guys are particularly militant about the relationship over the colonial period. And I have been to one of your Gatsby Day celebrations. I'm not totally sure I should be present where there's a ceremonial burning of a British warship. But it's a wonderful, I think, testament to the strength of the relationship that we can have that kind of fun with each other. So we promote the UK in sort of general terms. But I guess of the most interest to your membership, the largest part of the consulate that I run is our trade and investment team. We focus on a number of specific sectors here in New England. It doesn't mean we're exclusive and we only focus on those, but our priorities are in biotech and the life sciences, financial professional business services, including things like fintech, insurance, insurtech. We also have a very strong clean energy team, and we also have a team looking at emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and some of the advanced materials and semiconductors and things that are powering the kind of the modern economy. So we're really, really well set up on the trade and investment side. What's also really exciting about what we do is that we have a very strong what we call our science and innovation team. And they look at products that are further down the sort of development spectrum. So things that are being developed that are before, that are not yet ready to be sold and marketed. And that means we can support those areas with research partnerships, with funding where it's available, taking groups of researchers to the UK, bringing UK researchers to the US to help look at how we advance some of those technologies. So I'll give you a concrete example. About 10 years ago, that science and innovation team was really prioritizing offshore wind when the technology and the engineering wasn't quite there yet for the offshore wind sector. Now, of course, offshore wind is very much in the commercial sector, in the commercial side of things. And so the science and innovation team has handed that off the trade and investment team to look at where British companies can help support New England's ambitions to be the offshore wind capital of the United States, if not the world. So we've got a really interesting team that works together on that spectrum of early development through to marketability. We have a press, politics, and public affairs team as well that helps support my outreach to senior leaders across New England. So I was down in Providence not that long ago, meeting Governor McKee and Secretary Tanner. Fantastic team you have there in the State House. And we also do, of course, we do consular services, so supporting British nationals who get into trouble in New England and for whatever reason can't support themselves. So I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the things that we do here up in Boston.
Very interesting. So thank you for that overview. That was very helpful. And one of the things that jumped out at me with your with your opening remarks were your comments about wind and our ambitions, of course, to be the capital of offshore wind, not just here in the U.S., but throughout the world. What, if you pardon the pun, the headwinds? What are some of the headwinds impacting offshore wind these days? And do you see that as well in the UK, where there's been some unexpected pauses and maybe licensing and approvals have been delayed from various parts. What is your current assessment of the industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there definitely have been some headwinds. I've been working on offshore wind in New England for 3 years, and when I arrived, we were in the middle of the pandemic, yes, but I think there was much more widespread enthusiasm and ambition about offshore wind in, say, 2020, 2021 than there is now. And I think there are a number of different headwinds. I think one is very significant, and I think that the war in Ukraine has caused, I think, a reassessment around the world of different countries' reliance on particular forms of energy. I think it's also meant that it's really tested supply chains, and I think one of the world's largest manufacturers of offshore wind turbine blades is actually based in Ukraine, and their ability to supply the market has been severely constrained by the war, right at the time where demand has really been surging in New England and in other places. So I think the pressures on the energy market, the pressures on the supply chain, of course, we've seen inflation really surging in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, elsewhere. That has been coming down recently, and I think that's a really positive sign. But the inflation has changed things a little bit in the offshore wind market. I mean, I think very specific issue for the US, not just for the US, but your market here, your offshore wind sector in the US is a little bit less mature than it is in Europe. I think you've got there's a skills and a workforce kind of question that you guys need to overcome. I mean, put very simply, I think the level of ambition from the White House and from some of the state capitals, I think, is very high, and rightly so. But I don't think you yet have the skill base to be able to deliver that entirely with American workers. So, I mean, it's a great opportunity for countries like the United Kingdom. The UK has the world's greatest amount of installed offshore wind capacity. We have the world's second, third largest operating offshore wind farms. We have the world's only floating operational offshore wind farm, and decades of experience that we can help in New England and help support New England's ambitions in this area. And I hope we can get into this a little bit more about some of the things that we've been doing. But there is this tension in the United States with this desire, I think, to buy American, to invest in American skills, invest in American workers. And I mean, that's absolutely right and proper for a country to want to do that. But I think when you've got an industry or a sector that's growing, you need to be flexible enough and open enough to rely on global trade and global skills. There was a very interesting cover story in the Boston Globe just a couple of days ago about the Jones Act, which those of your listeners who are involved in the offshore wind sector and in other sectors will know about the Jones Act. It makes it quite difficult for international companies to help support the US offshore wind sector when you have legislation like that plays that kind of constraining role. So I think there are some headwinds, as I've set out. But one of the things I love about America is your ability to confront headwinds and to find ways around them.
Now, the Jones Act pertains to the flying of foreign flags with commercial vessels, correct?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And in the offshore wind sector, you have a number of very, very important vessels, some very particular kinds of vessels that are needed to install the turbines, to install the footings in the seabed. And there are really only a handful of those vessels in the world. I mean, they're absolutely colossal. And so if you can't take advantage of those, or if you have constraints on how you can take advantage of those vessels, then it puts a real it puts real obstacles in the way of installing these major wind farms.
So you point out the war in Ukraine and sort of a double-edged sword as it pertains to wind energy. First, you said that the supply chain, there is quite a hefty supply chain in the UK, particularly around the turbine manufacturers. But you also expressed some concern about putting all of one's country's eggs in one basket relative to fuel sources. So thinking about oil and the war in Ukraine and the embargoes and the like, wouldn't that potentially open up more discretion for clean energy, such as wind power? And I can totally see the inflationary pieces, and I can see the supply chain blockages. But what about the world's capacity, the world's understanding for oil source or source of fuel diversification?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think one of the UK government's goals in this area is to have as diverse a mix of energy as possible. Unlike some countries, we have always been supportive of our nuclear industry, and we still think that nuclear needs to be very much a part of our energy mix, alongside both offshore and onshore wind. We have committed as a country to phase out the use of coal in our energy mix. I think that's very much still a commitment, but we're not going to be able to do that overnight. And I think the recognition that what's happened in Ukraine has given is that you have to have some resilience in your energy mix. And I think that some of the most ambitious goals that happened pre-war in Ukraine about getting rid of fossil fuels entirely, I think that's what the war in Ukraine has shown us and has asked us to revisit, is that question of quite how quickly we can move to a net zero economy. So I think advanced economies like the UK, like the US, recognise that there has to be a diversity of sources of energy in our mix, and offshore wind and onshore wind, the technology is there to really make that a very significant part of our energy mix. I mean, in the UK last year, there was a period last year where wind power was providing 85% of the UK's electrical needs, and that's an extraordinary percentage for an economy the size of the UK. So I think it's clear that it's very much the future. The headwinds that I've already talked about are certainly there. There are other headwinds. I mean, there's still kind of public, in some sectors of the public, opposition to offshore wind, onshore and offshore wind turbines. There are people who don't like the way they look. They don't like the impact on the landscape. There are whole industries that are opposed to particularly offshore wind, and I know you've seen this in New England, that the lobster industry, the fishing industry, very opposed, I think, to the installation of more offshore wind turbines, and I think with some very legitimate concerns about the impact that they will have on their industries. But when I've talked about this, I say that the greatest threat to the lobster industry, to the fishing industry, is not wind turbines; it's climate change, and it's the warming seas. And you and your listeners will know that the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world, and that will affect the lobster population. That will affect the fish populations much more than the offshore wind farms.
Yeah, absolutely. So the lobsters are migrating further north than the Gulf of Maine because of the absence of really cold water in that northern tier. Correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good overview. Lots of differing perspectives on the wind industry. So let's transition to another one of our competitive industries, one that we are very favorably disposed to here in Rhode Island, and that is life sciences and biotechnology. So where are you looking for synergies with your UK trading partners?
So the UK has probably the second or third largest and most innovative life sciences and biotech sectors in the world. We have some of the best universities, some of the best. If you go back sort of historically, Dolly the sheep was first cloned in the United Kingdom. The double helix DNA was first discovered in the United Kingdom. The AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was the only other COVID vaccine that was developed outside the United States. It's the COVID vaccine that has essentially vaccinated the world against COVID. Now, obviously, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines were really powerful in their own right, but as we know from going through the pandemic, the AstraZeneca vaccine was the only one that didn't require refrigeration, so therefore was able to be distributed to the developing world. So we've really been for decades, if not centuries, out ahead in the UK on biotech and the life sciences. So what we're trying to do is attract some of your biotech, some of your life sciences companies to think about investing in the UK. We were delighted last year when Moderna announced a 10-year investment partnership in the UK to build a vaccine manufacturing centre, not just for COVID, but to use their mRNA platform to help develop sort of boutique treatments for cancer and a whole range of other conditions. And they did that in the UK because the UK was the only place that offered the extent of both the manufacturing capability and the intellectual capability from some of our really world-class universities. So there's lots of opportunity for American biotech and life sciences companies who are interested in expanding internationally to expand to the UK. And what we also do is help going the other way, is help British life sciences and biotech companies that are looking to expand internationally, trying to persuade them that not that it needs much persuading, I have to say, but demonstrating the benefits of New England. Traditionally, of course, it's been Kendall Square in Boston that has been the centre of biotech and life sciences, but I know that that is no longer just the place that people come, and that there are really, really interesting clusters of biotech and life sciences across this region, particularly in Rhode Island, as you say, and taking advantage of some of your great universities as well.
We are talking to Dr. Peter Abbott. He's the British Consul General. We're talking about all things New England trade and investment. He has great insights into competitive industries here throughout New England, and also what's happening in the UK and how we can continue to forge some really important workforce and economic development relationships. So this is a subject matter that we are deeply engaged in, Dr. Abbott. So this has been a really fascinating conversation. So let's move on to headwinds in the therapeutics industry. So in the U.S., as you well know, what we see a lot is pressure around pricing in the costs of the extensive R&D, startup costs, and also issues around equity in the distribution of therapeutics. And you mentioned the distribution of the COVID vaccine, the AstraZeneca, into developing countries because it didn't need refrigeration. That particular solution. So what are you seeing from a global perspective if you take a look at your outlook for this particular sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all. I think that's all right, Laurie. I think you will remember that towards the end of the pandemic, there was a lot of intellectual property and about making the recipes for want of a better word for the mRNA. I hope you can still hear me, by the way. I just had a little bit of a glitch.
We can hear you. Yes, you froze for just a moment, but you are back.
Okay, great, super. There was a lot of talk about making the recipes for these mRNA vaccines available widely, and I think I can see the argument. I can see why people feel that these vaccines needed to be made available as widely and as quickly as possible. But I don't think that making those recipes available is the right way forward. I mean, intellectual property, the ability to innovate, is really the oil that just keeps our economies, our creative economies, our innovation economies going. I think it would be a very dangerous principle to have established by making that IP widely available. I mean, what you saw with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was really interesting, and it didn't get as much airtime as I perhaps might have wished it could have done, was the AstraZeneca vaccine was offered entirely cost. The AstraZeneca gave up all the profits on its AstraZeneca vaccine for the duration of the pandemic, and so that was another way to make sure that these life-saving drugs, these life-saving vaccines, were made as widely available as possible, particularly, as I said, in the developing world. So there are ways, I think, around some of these equity questions without having to think about things like intellectual property. I just think that's a very risky approach to make. I mean, there are some other headwinds. I think you're right to identify that. I think there have been a number of stories recently about the cooling kind of biotech and life sciences market, certainly here in Boston. We have to remember we've gone through an extraordinary last couple of years with an extraordinary level of focus on this particular sector and on the things that it can and can't deliver. And I think probably it's fair to say that there was a little bit of hype and a little bit of over-exaggeration, perhaps. And so there's a natural kind of cooling effect. But there's no doubt, in my mind, you look at some of the extraordinary technologies, some of the companies that I've visited here in New England that have on offer, that we are entering, well, maybe we're already in it, but a golden age of, as I said, boutique, targeted drugs and treatments for patients that are much more efficacious. The UK has a very different healthcare system to the US. We have the National Health Service. It's free at the point of demand. It's a really remarkable health service, but very different to yours. And I think we look at the sector generally. One of the things that American life sciences pharmaceutical companies love about the United Kingdom is that we have this single healthcare system, and we have a very, very robust, efficient, and fast clinical trials system, built on the back of that national healthcare system. So if somebody wants to put a medicine through trials in the UK, particularly for a rare disease, you can get a subset of kind of 150 patients with a very rare disease very, very easily. And that makes the NHS in the UK a very attractive place to do clinical trials. So if you have people listening who are interested in doing clinical trials outside the United States, I would say the UK is probably one of the best places in the world to do that.
Wondering what your assessment is about the current state of the UK economy, particularly after Brexit. What have you seen has been any type of material change in either psychologically or truly economically in terms of what's happened to the UK's overall economic picture since Brexit?
Yeah, so I think the UK's economic picture is still exceptionally strong. We're not the fastest growing G7 economy, but we're not the slowest growing G7 economy. I mean, all of our economies are facing the kinds of headwinds that we have talked about. We're still the only trillion-dollar tech economy in the world after the US and China. We have one of the largest, as I said, one of the largest biotech and life sciences sectors in the world. London recently took the crown from New York as the city most favourable to tech development, which is really fantastic for us. We have more unicorns, so more startups valued at more than $1 billion or more than France and Germany and the rest of the EU combined in the UK. So really some remarkable strengths of the UK economy. I think you sort of, in your question, you talked about the psychology. I think it's there have been some real benefits for the US. I mean, I hear more and more British companies saying, well, we might have traded with the EU, we might have invested in the EU in the past. Brexit has made us sort of think, that's maybe a bit more complicated than it was before, and so let's turn westwards and look at the US. And then so suddenly you've got all these companies coming to America, thinking about investing in America, trading with America, that might not necessarily have done that in the past. And I think that's a really positive thing for our two economies. Over $1 trillion is invested in each of our economies by the UK and the US, both ways, and it's an amazing amount of money. We are each other's largest trading partner, and I mean, it's an extraordinary trading relationship, and I think Brexit has strengthened that and added more opportunities to that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I would certainly echo that, and also reinforce relationships on the northern border with Canada, and our particularly around the agricultural and lumber. So truly representing New England. Do you see any reciprocal relationships there with the Canadians?
Yeah, that's sort of slightly outside my bailiwick. I mean, certainly when you look at the trading partners for New England states, they overwhelmingly tend to be Canada focused, but the UK is very high up there. I think the UK is in the top 5 trading partners for every single New England state, and our ambition is to increase that, not just in goods but also in services. I talked a little bit about financial services earlier. There's some very across New England, some long-standing financial services sectors doing really interesting things around insurtech and fintech, and we want to try and build that trading relationship as well. We've also been doing some very interesting work on what's called mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and the UK and the US just signed a mutual recognition agreement with the architecture sector. So now UK and US architects are able to practice in each other's countries without the requirement for additional regulation or particular professional qualifications. And we're moving on to other sectors. We're hoping to do something similar with the engineering sector, and there'll be others down the line as well. So really building the long-standing foundations for a much deeper trading relationship, and relationship based on services and based on some of the things that really UK and US engineers, UK, US architects are some of the best in the world. So we should be making it easier for those professions to work in each other's countries.
Mm-hmm. So would that sort of sit beside the H-1B visa situation in terms of being able to, accelerate and really, provide additional workforce acumen in these sectors, in the architectural sector, as you mentioned?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a little bit separate from the visa question. It's more about making sure that there aren't regulatory barriers put in place for professions to come and work in the US versus the UK. But certainly with the overall goal of deepening that relationship.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to talk to you about an area of focus from the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce perspective, and that is around ESG and sustainability. And we know from our research and our work and our study, certainly that our European friends are much further ahead of the United States in terms of embracing the sustainability metrics that are known as the E, S, and the G. And the UK has some very well established regulations in terms of investment and in terms of mandates that are put on companies, particularly publicly traded companies, to assess and report and have certain attestations around the work that they're doing to make sure that that the UK and Europe in particular becomes or maintains its leadership role in the race to net zero. So we are endeavoring to do a lot of that work here through the auspices of the chamber. So Could you talk a little bit about how you see the philosophical variances, the differences between how ESG is perceived in the UK or in Europe in general, and what you might see here in the US?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We recently had a visit by our Minister for Investment, Lord Johnson. He was here in Boston a few weeks ago, and very interested in green finance and green investment. And we had a round table with a number of ESG investors. And one of the first things that they said to us was, "Don't ESG." Nobody says ESG anymore. Apparently it's not the term of art. People talk about impact investing these days, and I think, you know, it was a sort of interesting insight into how this particular field has changed and is changing very rapidly. I think there is a certain amount of skepticism. I think, I'll be honest, particularly in the sort of green finance world, and perhaps more widely about the metrics that are being used, and about whether we really do know how to measure some of this stuff, or whether companies are actually being a little bit disingenuous, perhaps, with some of the ways that they are reporting their ESG metrics. There are companies that are, you know, one of the participants in the round table with the minister a couple of weeks back. Actually, his company is entirely devoted to getting under the skin of where, you know, if a company says they do X, Y, and Z on ESG, you know, really going through the company reports, going through the records, going through their finances, and really making sure that they are living up to what they say they're living up to. So I think there is still a really important piece of work to be done to make sure that all of these regulations and statutes are really delivering what the consumer and what the investor need, so that they can have transparency. They have the kind of guardrails that they need to know are in place to have confidence in a market that is increasingly and consumers that are increasingly questioning what the ESG credentials are of particular companies. So I think you're right to say the UK has been out ahead of the pack on some of this. I do think we would acknowledge that there is still a lot further to go, and we're working with the US, and particularly with New England, to do that. There's some really, really interesting green finance organisations up here, banks and other venture capital companies up here in New England that are doing some really interesting work.
So you mentioned impact investing, which is a little bit like thematic investing in the green space. But if you could open the lens just a little bit more and think about, from an individual company perspective that wants to adopt and embrace a sustainability agenda because their stakeholders are asking for it, or because they know that in order to attract talented workers, particularly younger workers want to go work with a company, for a company that is purpose driven, that cares about about the planet and its people. How have you seen the argument best articulated from a business perspective?
Well, I mean, assuming you don't think climate change is a hoax or is bad science, assuming you agree with the consensus that we are living in a warming planet and we are going to have to do something about the way that we are treating our home, then it makes absolute business sense to ensure that your company is working towards that goal. As you say, it's not just about people wanting to come and work for you, although that's important. It's about people wanting to buy your product or buy your service. And more, as these young people grow up and just they have more and more purchasing power, and their children and their children's children, you know, you're not going to want to be left behind. And so I think there is a very compelling financial and economic argument for becoming as green as you possibly can, as quickly as you possibly can. And there are a whole range now of consultancy services that will help you figure out how you get to net zero, not just in your immediate business, but in your supply chain as well. And that's, you know, that is even harder. But I think, you know, increasingly there's very little excuse really for why you can't be looking at really innovative and interesting ways to green your company, and that they don't have to be expensive ways either.
Fantastic. So we have reached the end of our time together, Dr. Peter Abbott. This has been fabulous and fascinating, British Consul. And we know that you are coming to Rhode Island in the coming days to visit the Naval College, I believe, and also to look at some of our defense and marine trade industries in Newport, correct?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, we're really looking forward to coming down. We're going to see the Newport Chamber of Commerce. I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm sure you're all friends,
Yes,
but
absolutely. We are all partners. We all work together, and Erin Donovan Boyle is an outstanding leader.
great. Yeah, no, but I will be. I'm hoping to be back in Providence in a couple of weeks' time for the Waterfire Festival. So we come down to Rhode Island on a pretty regular basis. So looking forward to being back.
Okay, so we invite you to come join us here on Chamber TV anytime, or visit with us at our offices, or if you have any particular activities or trade missions or other opportunities that you think our members might be interested in. Please do feel free to reach out as always, and we stand here to be a resource.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.